Okay, so we're online now, and we started out talking about Byzantium and Islam, two very important states and peoples in the early Middle Ages. Now we'll shift our attention back to Western Europe, and we will talk about some of the people groups in Western Europe. And our first one, the subject of today's lecture, will be the Franks, which of course were one of the Germanic groups that moved into the Roman province of Gaul, and they bequeathed their name to it. So we don't call it Gaul anymore, we call it France, after the Franks who settled there. Now the Franks were a disparate group, not necessarily unified, but they did recognize a king his name was, there was always a king, and this dynasty was known as the Merovingian dynasty. They had a mythical ancestor named Merovech. And the Merovingian king that everyone knows is named Clovis I, who reigned from 481 till 511. And Clovis was, well, he was a mob boss, really. He was one of these people who ruled by fear, very insecure about his position, so he had no problem committing preemptive murder in order to safeguard his position. But he did one thing that has earned him the great esteem of subsequent generations, and that is that he converted to Roman Catholicism in 496. Prior to this, he was an Arian Christian, which was a heresy in the eyes of the Roman Church. But, someone got to him and said, if you convert to Roman Catholicism, God will give you a victory in the battle. And so he got his victory in the battle, so he converted to Roman Catholicism. And so Clovis is considered the founder of Catholic France. So, when you convert to the right form of Christianity, lots of things will be forgiven. So Clovis, some people consider Clovis, in fact, a Christian saint. He is certainly seen as the mythical founder of France, okay? And in fact, a myth did grow up about this. That symbol there is called a fleur-de-lis. It is a stylized lily flower. And it is a French symbol. So if you go to New Orleans, you see fleur-de-lis all over the place, including on the helmets of their football team. If you go to St. Louis, there's fleur-de-lis all over the place. In Quebec, there are fleur-de-lis all over the place. And it was the symbol, the emblem of the medieval French Catholic monarchy. It comes from, it comes much later, but there's a rumor, there's a myth that it was given to Clovis when he converted. And you can see there a manuscript illumination of angels bringing it down from heaven, giving it to a hermit who gave it to the queen, who then presented it to Clovis. Okay, so those are the Merovingians. They have a certain prestige. But there are other families of Franks, one of whom was known as the Carolingians. And the Carolingians actually had a lock on a very important Frankish office. It was known as Mayor of the Palace, which was essentially they were in charge of the army. And in 732, the Carolingian Mayor of the Palace scored a major victory, not just against any enemy, but a Muslim enemy. Remember that Spain is Muslim. Starting in 711, the Muslims crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and very quickly conquered all of Spain. So Spain, throughout most of the Middle Ages, is Muslim. And of course, they're not going to stop there. They sent a party north of the Pyrenees Mountains into what is now France, where they met a Carolingian army or a Frankish army under the Carolingian mayor of the palace, whose name was Charles Martel. And Charles Martel defeated them at the Battle of Tours in 732. So the idea is that if it wasn't for him, we'd all be speaking Arabic now. That Charles Martel defended Christian Europe from conquest by the Muslims. I don't know if that's necessarily true. The Muslims could have tried again the next year, but they never bothered to. Okay, so they probably reached the limits of their ability to conquer. And certainly it gave immense prestige to the Carolingians, although all they succeeded in doing was keeping Europe backward. I mean, the Caliphate was a lot more sophisticated than Western Europe was at the time. All right, and there's an illustration of Charles Martel defeating the Muslims at Tours. Okay. Charles's successor as mayor of the palace was named Pepin the Short. It's very interesting, some of these nicknames that people get. So presumably he wasn't very tall. But that doesn't mean he wasn't clever, or he wasn't very politically astute. And he wrote to the Pope, and he said to the Pope, you know, look at me, I'm the Carolingian mayor of the palace, and I have immense prestige, but I don't have any power. Whereas the Merovingian king of the Franks, he has all the power, but he doesn't have any prestige. Do you think that's a right to have happen? And Pope Zachary wrote back and said, yeah, you're right. You go right ahead and do what you need to do. So, with papal blessing, Pepin the Short fomented a coup. He deposed Childeric III, the last Merovingian king. Childeric had his head shaved, and he was packed off to a monastery. The Frankish kings grew their hair long, so if you shaved their heads, that was basically symbolic of them not being king anymore. So now, you've got Pepin the Short becomes King Pepin, king of the Franks, and the Pope himself came north of the Alps and crowned Pepin king of the Franks in 751. This is the beginning of what historians call the Franco-Papal Alliance. Keep in mind that the papacy is feeling a little bit insecure. There's a new group in northern Italy called the Lombards that the Pope interpreted as they're very threatening to him. But the Byzantines, for their part, had gone in for iconoclasm. So the Pope doesn't feel that he can trust the Eastern Roman Emperor. So he looks around and he sees the Franks are up in France, and maybe the Franks can be the protector of the papacy. And so they have this little arrangement whereby the Pope would support the King of France in various ways, and the Franks would support the Pope in various ways. All right, so that is Pepin the Short, king of the Franks. So if Pepin was impressive, how much more impressive is Pepin's successor, Charles the Great? He reigned from 768 down to 814, which is quite a long time. Now, that's technically what he's called in English, Charles the Great. Certainly he's called Carolus Magnus in Latin, or Karl der Grosse in German, both of which are translated as Charles the Great. However, generally he is not known as Charles the Great in English, but as Charlemagne. Okay, now how does Charlemagne come into it? Charlemagne is the old French version of his name. And it stuck in English. And it's stuck largely because of the book, the cover there is on the right. It's called The Song of Roland. Charles the Great very quickly he was a larger-than-life figure. And he became ever more prestigious and larger than life after he died. Okay, it's almost like King Arthur. he became this figure of myth and legend. And so they told stories about him, one of which was the Song of Roland. Song of Roland was written in Old French, and it was very popular among the Norman rulers of England. And so from there, this Old French version of the name Charles the Great stuck in English. So that's why we tend to call him Charlemagne. And Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, was very important. He was very great on a number of levels. Number one, you can see there on the map, he was a great conqueror. Okay? A great conqueror. One of the features, one of the reasons why the Merovingians had lost a lot of power is because they practiced the Frankish custom of partible inheritance. So, let's compare things to Her Majesty the Queen. Her Majesty the Queen has 4 children. But, should something happen to her, the whole thing will pass to her first son, Prince Charles, who will be crowned King Charles III. Princess Anne, as a female, doesn't get to inherit, but neither does Prince Andrew and Prince Edward either. Okay, they are the younger sons of the sovereign, and they have to find something else to do. Particularly Prince Andrew, who's in hot water right now over his association with Jeffrey Epstein. Okay, but these two, they have to find their own careers. They are not going to be king, unless King Charles dies. But actually, if King Charles dies, then the crown passes to Prince William. So those two, Edward and Andrew, it's not likely that they're going to be inheriting the throne. Okay, this is called primogeniture. All right, the first son gets everything. That is not what the Franks practiced. The Franks practiced partible inheritance. And that's true of a kingdom. So you've got the king of the Franks, but he dies, leaving a number of surviving sons. The territory has to be chopped up and shared among all of them. Now, the eldest son is usually going to be designated king, but his lands keep shrinking. So Charlemagne, what he has to do now that he's king is that he has to conquer all that other territory. And he manages to do it. Okay, so he asserts himself over his own territory. And then he goes beyond that. Okay, so as you can see, he's conquered France, and then he's moved into what is now Germany. He conquers Saxony. He conquers Bavaria, Carinthia. You can see there he's conquered Lombardy, and the Pope was very grateful for that. You can see he did some raids into what is now the Czech Republic, and even, beyond that. You can also see in northern Spain there, in Catalonia, he extended his territory into Spain as well. So, in fact, that's what the Song of Roland comes from. It's about a battle that took place during his reconquest of Spain. And in fact, that is what it's called. It's called the Reconquista. It's a process that begins by Charlemagne and ends in 1492, when Christians, little by little, took back Spain from the Muslims. I mean, it took them 700 years, but eventually, yes, Spain comes to be dominated by Christians, and the Muslims are kicked out of Spain. So Catalonia is the first part of that process. The Catalans, even today, are kind of independent-minded. Catalan is its own language. And they sometimes there's bad blood between the Catalans and the rest of the Spanish. So this is great. So Charlemagne, he's a great conqueror. Nothing succeeds like success. He was very energetic, okay, very tall, always, wanting to do something, and everyone else was struggling to keep up with him. But, every year he goes out, conquers more stuff, has more booty to reward his followers. the more demoralized his potential enemies become. And so it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It's just getting bigger and bigger. So not only is Charlemagne a great conqueror, he was also a great administrator. I mean, it's one thing to conquer, it's quite another to be able to govern what you've conquered. And what Charlemagne did is that he divided his empire into subunits. And there were sort of two levels of subunit. If it was big and rich, it was called a duchy. If it was a little smaller and not quite as rich, it was called a county. And the people in charge of these were dukes and counts. Okay, so if Aquitaine is a duchy, and Aquitaine is going to have a Duke of Aquitaine in charge of it. Counties, what's a county? Toulouse was a county, so you're going to have Raymond, Count of Toulouse, in charge of that particular county. We have counties in America, but they're not really counties because titles of nobility are forbidden by our Constitution. So unfortunately, there's no Count of Cherokee. It's one of those names that's stuck. Even though we don't have titles of nobility, we still call subunits counties. Maybe we should call them duchies or something else. Anyways, dukes and counts, they administered their duchies and counties, their fiefdoms, on behalf of the king. They collected tax for him. They raised men for the army. They administered justice. And they, in general, they kept rebellions down. And obviously they would have people below them on the hierarchy doing some of this work for them. Now, human nature being what it is, a lot of these dukes and counts would run their little fiefdoms to their own benefit. The classic case is, you collect $100 in tax, and you pass maybe 2 of it on to Charlemagne, and you say, sorry, it just was a terrible year. We didn't collect all that much tax this year. Well, that's not a trick you'd want to play on Charlemagne, actually. That's Charlemagne, as I say, was tall and vigorous and energetic and had attention to detail, and he made sure that his dukes and his counts were actually doing what he wanted them to do. So, if you're the Duke of Aquitaine, every now and then the Missi Dominici would show up. Missi Dominici being messengers of the Lord. They would show up and they want to have a look at your books, and if there were any questions, any shenanigans that were going on, the Duke of Aquitaine would have to present himself at the court of Charlemagne, and he might be in very serious hot water. So yes, Charlemagne, he can't govern the whole thing. I mean, you don't have a bureaucracy, okay? You have outsourced government, but at the same time, you can keep an eye on them. Through messengers, through spies. So that's another reason why Charlemagne is great. And finally, he's also great on account of the so-called Carolingian Renaissance. Okay, it's not quite as impressive as the Renaissance that we see in Florence. But eventually Charlemagne establishes a capital of his empire at a place called Aachen, which in French is known as Aix-la-Chapelle. But I think it's best to call it Aachen simply because it is now in Germany. It's just over the border from Belgium. That was the Carolingian capital. And Charlemagne built himself a very impressive cathedral there. And he sponsored scholars from all across his empire to come and sort of adorn his court. And so there's a very distinctive Carolingian style of manuscript, a style of drawing, and a style of handwriting called Carolingian minuscule, which actually featured spaces between words for the first time. So we owe that to the Carolingian Renaissance, actually. And Alcuin and Einhard were 2 of the famous names who were associated with this so-called Carolingian Renaissance. Here are 2 views of the cathedral at Aachen. You can see there the interior of it. Not really impressive in terms of cathedrals, but certainly very impressive for the time. All right. One of the stranger events in the Middle Ages happened on Christmas Day in 800 AD. Charlemagne was in Rome, worshipping on Christmas, as you do. And allegedly the Pope snuck up behind him and stuck a crown on his head and said, "Hail Charlemagne, King of the Romans." And all the priests and bishops who were there immediately shouted out, "Hail Charlemagne, King of the Romans." And what this means is that the Western Roman Empire, whose last emperor had been deposed in 476, all of a sudden the Western Roman Empire is a thing again. Okay, and Charlemagne is going to be the new emperor. And he claimed it was a surprise. He claimed he had no idea what was going on, and the Pope snuck up behind him. So Charlemagne had nothing to do with it. Okay? When the Byzantines found out about this, they had a cow, and they said, "Who do you think you are? There is no more Western Roman Empire. It's gone. It's defunct. It's deceased. We are the only Roman emperors left. Who do you think you are, Mr. Pope, to try to revive the Western Roman Empire after a gap of 324 years?" Well, the Pope said, "Actually, I do have the right to make an emperor. I have this document here called the Donation of Constantine. And if you read it, you'll discover that Constantine, after the Battle of Milvian Bridge, and he converted to Christianity, he went to Constantinople and founded that as his eastern capital. But before he did, he bequeathed the rights to the Roman Empire to the Pope. And the Pope, I've been sitting on this document for many years, but finally we have a worthy candidate to succeed to the Western Roman Emperorship, and that is Charlemagne, and I make no apologies. I'm crowning, using this power given to me by Constantine, I am going to revive the Western Roman Empire." It's utter hogwash. The ink was barely dry on this document. It is full of anachronisms. That is, it's full of stuff that Constantine would never have known, right? But he got away with it, and from 800 all the way down to 1801, there is someone in Western Europe calling himself the Emperor, or the Roman Emperor, or sometimes the Holy Roman Emperor. So, of course, as the title of the slide says, what's going on? In some ways, this is the culmination of the Franco-Papal Alliance. Okay, here is the Pope doing a major solid for Charlemagne. Imagine the prestige of being the emperor again. Charlemagne likely knew what was going on. I mean, there's no way that he wouldn't have known. And for him to claim he didn't know what was going on, it was simply, he's trying to appear not greedy. He's trying to appear like he didn't actually want it. But of course, he would have wanted it very badly. He just can't appear that way. When it came time to crown his own son emperor, Charlemagne did it himself. He did not return to Rome to have the Pope do it. Because Charlemagne, he likes being emperor, but he doesn't want the Pope thinking that it's his gift. Charlemagne will happily become emperor, but then he'll take it from here, thank you very much. He does not want the Pope thinking that the Pope can make or break the emperor. So yeah, it's a Franco-Papal alliance, but there's also a little bit of competition in the relationship. Who is on top? Who is calling the shots? Who's giving orders to whom? And this, of course, is going to get much worse later on. There's the Franco-Papal alliance, or actually, I guess the Imperial-Papal alliance is going to break down completely. Okay, after Charlemagne, nothing lasts forever. Charlemagne dies in 814. He's succeeded by his sole surviving son, named Louis the Pious. As I may have mentioned before, You don't want a king who is known for his piety. You don't want someone who's a saint as well as a king. Generally, that is second prize. It means the king has sort of failed in his duty, so at least we can claim he was Christian. He was a good Christian. And Louis the Pious, he had some big shoes to fill. He reigned for some time, but he just wasn't as energetic or warlike as Charlemagne was. And, so without war booty coming into the treasury, he couldn't really reward followers as well as Charlemagne could. And of course the Vikings are starting to attack at this point. So Louis the Pious does not preside over the empire the way that Charlemagne did. But really bad things start to happen because he had 3 sons who survived to adulthood: Lothar, Charles the Bald, and Louis the German. Now, Louis the Pious tried to practice primogeniture. He tried to pass the whole thing off to Lothar. He had him crowned emperor. However, as I say there, primogeniture was not the Frankish custom. Charles and Louis made a mutual aid pact called the Oaths of Strasbourg in 841 and waged war against Lothar for a couple of years. And then in 843, they signed the Treaty of Verdun, which divided the empire into thirds. So this is what becomes of Charlemagne's empire. It gets divided into thirds. Charles the Bald got the western part, Louis the German got the eastern part, and Lothar, who's still designated emperor, but he only gets the middle kingdom, sort of a stretch of land going from the Netherlands down through Switzerland and then into northern Italy. So that's what becomes of Charlemagne's empire. Eventually, France and Germany expand and gobble up the so-called Middle Kingdom, and the emperorship passed to the King of Germany, which I have there. It's ironic because the Romans never ruled Germany, but now throughout the Middle Ages, the King of Germany is also the Holy Roman Emperor. But history is full of these ironies. Okay, so here's a portrait of Charlemagne. It's much later, of course. It's after the development of heraldry, but you see up there, Charlemagne has 2 coats of arms, one with fleur-de-lis on it. That, of course, comes from Clovis. So as the King of France, he would have had fleur-de-lis. But you also have up there an eagle. That is the symbol of the empire. And that, as you can see on the flag, becomes a German symbol because the emperor also is King of Germany. So you've got those 2 shields up there, the King of France and the King of Germany. So who is he? Is he French or German? People used to argue about this. They used to argue about Charlemagne. I think that there are a lot of people who don't like the fact that Europe is divided into countries that are always at war with each other. Wouldn't it be much better if Europe were united? Okay, and so if you believe in a kind of united Europe, you look back on Charlemagne with a great deal of nostalgia. I wouldn't be surprised if you went into the European Union and they had a big portrait of Charlemagne up there somewhere, because it's a similar, even today there are people who want a united Europe. They want to erase national boundaries. And Charlemagne is a shining example of that. Although that vision too has come under question recently with England leaving the European Union. Okay, so that is the story of the Franks. I mean, you could go into a lot more detail, but that's a thumbnail sketch of the greatest Frank of all, and that is Charlemagne.